At 2:55 p.m. on October 3, 1979, the skies over Windsor Locks, Connecticut, were darkening rapidly. A severe thunderstorm had been moving northeast across the state, and the National Weather Service had issued a severe thunderstorm warning for the area just after 2:30 p.m., but no tornado warning had been broadcast. The storm was still strengthening, and the public had no reason to believe this was any different from the dozens of summer storms that passed through each year. At 2:57 p.m., witnesses in the town of Simsbury, southwest of Windsor Locks, reported a rotating wall cloud descending from the base of the storm. The cloud was low and ragged, and within 2 minutes it had formed a visible funnel. The tornado touched down at approximately 2:59 p.m. on the western edge of Windsor Locks, near the Connecticut River. It was a violent tornado later rated F4 on the Fujita scale, with estimated wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour. At 3 p.m., the tornado crossed Interstate 90. Drivers saw the funnel approaching from the west, and some managed to pull over and take cover in ditches. One driver, a 32-year-old construction worker named Michael Johnson, was caught on the highway as the tornado passed directly over his car. He survived with minor injuries, but his vehicle was lifted and thrown into a guardrail. That was the first indication that this storm was not ordinary. At 3:01 p.m., the tornado entered the grounds of Bradley International Airport. The airport was busy with afternoon operations. Several aircraft were parked on the tarmac, including a McDonnell Douglas DC-9 operated by Allegheny Airlines which had just arrived from Philadelphia. The plane was empty with no passengers aboard, but ground crew were nearby. The tornado struck the east side of the airport first. At 3:01 p.m. and 30 seconds, the wind tore the roof off Hangar 4. Two mechanics inside the hangar took cover under a workbench. They survived, but the hangar collapsed around them. Minutes later, they crawled out to see the DC-9 had been flipped onto its back. At 3:02 p.m., the tornado reached the main terminal building. It ripped through the glass front of the terminal, sending shattered panels across the concourse. Dozens of passengers and employees scrambled into restrooms and hallways. The airport manager, Robert D. Murphy, was in his office when the pressure change blew out the windows. He later described the sound as a deep roar mixed with the screeching of tearing metal. The tornado lifted a baggage cart from the tarmac and hurled it through the roof of the terminal. Miraculously, no one inside was killed. At 3:03 p.m., the tornado crossed the airport's main runway. A fuel truck parked near the terminal was overturned, spilling thousands of gallons of jet fuel. Sparks from downed electrical lines ignited the fuel, and a fire erupted near the hangar area. Airport firefighters responded within minutes, but the fire spread quickly, fueled by the spilled fuel and propane tanks from a nearby warehouse. The fire would burn for more than an hour. At 3:04 p.m., the tornado left the airport property and moved into the residential neighborhoods of Windsor Locks. It followed a path roughly 1/4 mile wide, cutting through the town center. Homes in the path were completely destroyed. At 3:05 p.m., the tornado hit the Windsor Locks Elementary School. School had been dismissed earlier in the day and the building was empty except for a few custodians. They took shelter in a basement boiler room. The tornado ripped off the roof and collapsed the gymnasium walls. The custodians survived. At 3:07 p.m., the tornado struck a construction site on Route 75 where workers were building a new shopping plaza. One worker, 44-year-old John R. McCarthy, was caught in the open. He was thrown into a concrete foundation and killed instantly. He would be the first confirmed fatality. At 3:08 p.m., the tornado crossed the Windsor Locks Canal and moved into the neighboring town of Suffield. It continued northeast, eventually lifting at 3:12 p.m. near the Massachusetts border after a path length of approximately 13 miles. In all, the tornado destroyed more than 300 homes and damaged another 600. It left 3 people dead and more than 500 injured. The property damage was estimated at $260 million in 1979, which adjusted for inflation stands at well over $1 billion today. What happened that afternoon in Windsor Locks was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger outbreak of severe weather that swept across New England on October 3, 1979. The same storm system produced multiple tornadoes in Massachusetts and Rhode Island earlier that day, but the Windsor Locks tornado was the strongest and most destructive. It remains one of only 2 violent F4 tornadoes ever recorded in the state of Connecticut. The question investigators faced in the aftermath was straightforward but troubling. How could a tornado this powerful strike a populated area without a single tornado warning being issued? The National Weather Service had observed the storm on radar, but the radar technology of 1979 was limited. The radar system then in use was the WSR-57, a workhorse model that had been in service since the 1950s. It could detect precipitation and broad movement, but it could not resolve the subtle signatures that precede a tornado, such as the hook echo or the mesocyclone rotation. Those capabilities would not become standard until the deployment of Doppler radar in the 1990s. The forecaster on duty at the National Weather Service office in Hartford, Connecticut, noted the storm's intensity but did not see a rotation signature. In his post-event report, he stated that the storm appeared as a solid area of heavy rain on the radar screen, with no discernible hook or notch. Without that visual cue, the protocol at the time was to issue a severe thunderstorm warning but not a tornado warning. The decision was made in good faith based on available data, but it cost precious time. What happened at the local level compounded the problem. The town of Windsor Locks had no siren system. The Civil Defense Office relied on telephone call trees to warn key officials, a process that could take 20 to 30 minutes. By the time the first calls were made, the tornado was already on the ground. The local police dispatcher heard reports of funnel clouds from spotters in Simsbury around 2:58 p.m., but the phone lines were busy. The dispatcher tried to call the National Weather Service, but the call did not go through until after the tornado had struck the airport. One of the most significant failures was the lack of a trained spotter network. In 1979, the National Weather Service was still building its network of volunteer weather spotters. Connecticut had fewer than a dozen trained spotters in 1979, and none were positioned in Windsor Locks. The closest spotter was in Hartford, 15 miles away, and by the time he saw the tornado on the horizon, it was too late. The aftermath of the Windsor Locks tornado prompted a major reassessment of tornado warning systems in New England. In the years that followed, the region invested heavily in improved radar, expanded spotter programs, and better communication protocols. The town of Windsor Locks installed a siren system. The Federal Emergency Management Agency funded new emergency operations centers, but the most lasting change came at the federal level. The 1979 tornado helped accelerate the deployment of the next-generation weather radar system, which began in the mid-1980s and was fully operational by the early 1990s. That system, known as NEXRAD, uses Doppler technology to detect rotation in thunderstorms, giving forecasters the ability to issue tornado warnings with lead times of 10 to 15 minutes or more. The Windsor Locks tornado also exposed a critical gap in public awareness. Many residents told investigators they did not know what to do when the storm approached. Some stayed in their homes thinking they were safe. Others tried to drive away only to be caught in the storm. The town had not conducted tornado drills, and the local schools had no emergency plan for tornadoes. After the disaster, the state of Connecticut mandated tornado safety education in schools, and the National Weather Service launched a public outreach campaign that included storm spotter training and preparedness materials. The three people who died that day were John R. McCarthy, the construction worker, a 68-year-old woman named Elizabeth Torres, who was killed when her mobile home was thrown into a nearby pond, and a 55-year-old man named George H. Bennett, who died of a heart attack while trying to secure his garage doors. Their deaths, while tragic, could have been far higher. The fact that the tornado struck a school after dismissal, an airport with hundreds of people, and a densely populated residential area and killed only 3 people is a statistical anomaly. But that low death toll does not diminish the systemic failures that allowed the storm to go unwarned. Investigators from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Weather Service conducted a detailed review of the event. Their report, published in 1980, made several recommendations. Upgrade radar systems, establish a statewide spotter network, require all municipalities to install emergency warning sirens, and improve coordination between weather forecasters and local emergency managers. Many of those recommendations were implemented within the next decade. But the question that lingered and still lingers is whether a warning issued even 10 minutes earlier would have changed the outcome. There is no clear answer. The tornado touched down within 2 minutes of the first reported funnel cloud. A warning issued at 2:50 p.m. would have given only 5 minutes of lead time. That is tight but not impossible. Many residents who survived said they saw the sky turn green and felt the air go still, but they did not connect those signs to tornado danger. They had never been told to look for such signs. What happened in Windsor Locks was not just a failure of radar. It was a failure of education, planning, and communication. The event still matters today because it illustrates how vulnerable communities can be even when the technology of the time is used correctly. The radar did not fail. The forecaster made a reasonable decision based on the tools available, but the tools themselves were inadequate, and the infrastructure to disseminate warnings once they were issued was not robust enough. Those lessons remain relevant as new challenges emerge. The increasing frequency of severe weather due to climate change, the need for rapid messaging through mobile phones, and the ongoing requirement for community-level preparedness. The Windsor Locks tornado of 1979 is a case study in how a relatively rare event in New England can expose weaknesses in a system designed for a different climate. It forced changes that saved lives in later outbreaks, including the 2011 tornado outbreak in Massachusetts and the 2022 tornado in Connecticut. but it also stands as a reminder that no system is perfect. On October 3rd, 1979, in a small town in Connecticut, the weather took a turn that no one saw coming, and the response, for all its good intentions, was just a few minutes too slow. At 3 p.m. on October 3rd, 1979, the tornado had already crossed the Connecticut River and was bearing down on the Bradley International Airport Terminal building. The airport tower controller saw the funnel cloud approaching from the southwest. He ordered an immediate evacuation of the terminal and the ramp, but the warning came less than 30 seconds before the tornado struck. Passengers and employees scrambled for shelter in restrooms, hallways, and under counters. The tower itself was not evacuated. The controller stayed at his post, watching the storm close in. The tornado hit the terminal at 3:01 p.m. It tore off a large section of the roof, collapsed a concourse wall, and shattered dozens of windows. Debris was sucked into the jet intake of a parked United Airlines DC-9, causing an explosion of metal and glass. The aircraft was shoved sideways across the tarmac and came to rest against a hangar. Inside the terminal, luggage carts, chairs, and signs became projectiles. 2 passengers were injured by flying glass. A maintenance worker was knocked unconscious by a falling ceiling panel. The tower itself shook violently, but the controller held onto the console and remained on duty. At the same moment, the tornado crossed the main runway and hit the Bradley Field Air National Guard base. The base housed the 103rd Tactical Fighter Wing, equipped with A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft. The tornado caught several A-10s parked on the flight line. It overturned 2, flipped a third onto its back, and peppered each with debris. Fuel and hydraulic fluid leaked across the tarmac. No fires ignited, but the damage to the airframes was severe. The National Guard had no time to move the aircraft. The base emergency siren did not sound until after the tornado had passed. What happened inside the base command post was a breakdown in information flow. The base had its own weather monitoring system, but it was not connected to the National Weather Service radar. The duty officer saw the storm on a local television weather radar, but that feed was delayed by several minutes. By the time he issued an alert, the tornado was on the ground. The base lost telephone lines during the storm, so the report of the damage could not be transmitted until landlines were restored 20 minutes later. The tornado then moved into the residential neighborhoods along the western edge of Windsor Locks. It struck the Woodlawn Mobile Home Park at 3:03 p.m. The park contained 63 mobile homes, most of which were not anchored to foundations. The tornado lifted 12 homes off their supports and scattered them across the park. One home was thrown into a pond, killing Elizabeth Torres. Another home was wrapped around a tree, its aluminum siding peeled back like a banana. Survivors emerged from bathtubs and closets. Some had crawled under their beds. One woman grabbed her infant and hid inside a refrigerator box that had been stored in her living room. The box was swept 50 yards and landed in a neighbor's yard. Both survived. The construction site near the Windsor Locks Town Hall was hit at 3:05 p.m. John R. McCarthy was working on the subcontractor crew. He had been on the ground floor of the steel frame building when the tornado struck. According to workers who survived, McCarthy had no time to run. The building collapsed inward and he was crushed by a falling beam. 3 other workers were injured, one critically. The site foreman later testified that no weather radio was available on site, and the crew had not heard the severe thunderstorm warning issued at 2:40 p.m. They did not know the storm was coming. Rescue operations began almost immediately. The Windsor Locks Volunteer Fire Department arrived at the mobile home park within 4 minutes of the tornado's passage, but the roads were blocked by downed trees and power lines. Firefighters had to cut through debris on foot. The first ambulance arrived at 3:12 p.m. By 3:20, a triage center was set up at the town hall, but the town hall itself had lost power. Emergency generators had not been pre-positioned. The generators were stored in a basement that had flooded when the roof was torn off. It took 2 hours to bring portable generators from neighboring towns. The hospital in Hartford, St. Francis Hospital and Medical Center, received 27 injured patients within the first hour. The emergency room was not expecting a mass casualty event. The hospital had a disaster plan, but it had not been activated because the hospital had not received a warning. The first patients arrived by private car, driven by neighbors who had no training in medical transport. Hospital staff reported that some patients arrived with incorrect triage tags, leading to duplications and delays. 2 victims with internal injuries were treated in the hallway because the trauma bays were full. The Connecticut State Police set up a command post at the airport at 3:45 p.m. The National Guard was activated at 3:50 p.m. But since the base itself was damaged, it took 45 minutes to assemble a response team from the undamaged units in Hartford. The Federal Emergency Management Agency did not arrive until the next morning. The local emergency manager, a volunteer, had been at his regular job at a hardware store when the tornado struck. He had to drive to the town hall, which took 20 minutes because of blocked roads. By the time he established communications, the rescue was already underway by neighbors and volunteers. Investigators from the National Weather Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration arrived on October 4th, the day after the tornado. They surveyed the damage track from the air and on the ground. They measured the width of the damage path at its widest point, 1/3 of a mile. They estimated the wind speed based on the damage to structures, at least 200 miles per hour in the most intense areas. The F4 rating was confirmed. The path length was measured at 12.5 miles from the Connecticut River near the Massachusetts border to just south of the Hartford City line, but the damage was not continuous. The tornado skipped and lifted several times, a pattern common to severe tornadoes in New England. The investigation focused on 3 key failures. The first was radar. The WSR-57 radar could not detect rotation. The forecaster in Hartford had no way to see the hook echo. He had to rely on spotter reports, and there were none. The second failure was communication. The National Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning at 2:40 p.m., but it was not sent directly to Windsor Locks. It was sent to the state police, who then had to relay it to local police. The local police dispatcher received the warning at 2:50 p.m., but by then the tornado was already forming. The third failure was public awareness. No tornado warning was ever issued. The severe thunderstorm warning was not specific enough. People did not know to take shelter. The report also noted that the National Weather Service had no direct telephone line to the Hartford County Civil Defense Office. The Civil Defense Director had to call the Weather Service through a switchboard. When he tried to call at 2:55 p.m., the line was busy. He did not get through until 3:10 p.m. after the tornado had passed. The report recommended installing a dedicated hotline for emergencies. The Windsor Locks tornado also raised questions about building codes. The mobile home park was located in a floodplain, but no special anchoring requirements existed for tornadoes. The airport terminal building had a lightweight roof that was not tied down to the structure. The construction site had no weather safety plan. Recommendations from the investigation included requiring all mobile homes to be anchored to concrete slabs, requiring all public buildings to have interior safe rooms, and requiring all construction sites to have a designated weather monitor with access to a weather radio. In the years that followed, the state of Connecticut adopted a uniform building code that included wind loading standards for roofs and walls. The town of Windsor Locks installed a siren system with 8 sirens, each tested monthly. The siren system was completed in 1982 and cost $400,000. The Federal Emergency Management Agency funded emergency operations centers in every county. The National Weather Service expanded its spotter program, training more than 2,000 volunteers in Connecticut by 198.5. The program was called SKYWARN, and it remains active today. The most significant legacy of the Windsor Locks tornado was its role in the national push for Doppler radar. In 1981, the National Weather Service published a white paper arguing that Doppler radar could have provided a 15-minute warning for the Windsor Locks tornado. The paper was used to justify funding for the Next Generation Weather Radar program. The first NexRad radar was installed in 1986 in Oklahoma. By 1993, the network covered the entire continental United States. The radar in Hartford was upgraded to NexRad in 1995. Since then, the lead time for tornado warnings in Connecticut has averaged 15 minutes, but the human cost of the 1979 tornado is not measured only in lead times and building codes. The 3 people who died left families. Elizabeth Torres was a grandmother who had moved to Windsor Locks from Puerto Rico 5 years earlier. She had been saving money to bring her daughter and grandchildren to the United States. John McCarthy was a father of 3 who had taken the construction job because the pay was better than his previous work. George Bennett had a history of heart disease and was not aware of the storm. His widow testified at a public hearing that she had not heard any warning. She said she went to the basement when she saw the sky, but her husband stayed upstairs to close the garage door. He never made it. The event also changed the culture of emergency management in Connecticut. Before 1979, tornadoes were seen as a Midwest problem. After 1979, every town in the state was required to develop an emergency operations plan. The state created a position for a full-time tornado preparedness coordinator. The National Weather Service began conducting annual tornado drills in schools. By the time a tornado struck Massachusetts in 2011, the system worked. The warning came 15 minutes ahead. No one died in that event. The Windsor Locks tornado of 1979 remains a cautionary tale. It shows that vulnerability does not require a direct hit of rare intensity. It requires only a gap in the chain of warning and awareness. The chain may have had weak links, but those weak links were repaired. The tornado itself was an act of nature. The tragedy was that the response was not ready, and that readiness, once achieved, saved lives in later years. The storm is long past, but its echo persists in every siren test, every weather drill, every radar upgrade. The 3 people who died in Windsor Locks died because the storm arrived faster than the knowledge that it was coming. That gap has been closed, but it cannot be erased. It is a reminder that the cost of a few missing minutes in a storm that moves at 50 miles per hour is measured in lives. The lasting question is not whether the system failed, but how many failures had to align for a single event to become a disaster. Radar, communication, education, infrastructure, each was inadequate in its own way. The tornado did not exploit a single flaw. It found many. And the response to that discovery across a decade of reforms shows what a society can do when it acknowledges that the weather is not the only variable in the equation. The margin of safety is built by people. And it can always be larger. In the end, the story of Windsor Locks is not unique. It resembles dozens of other tornado events from the era when radar was analog, when warnings were relayed by telephone, when sirens were rare. But it matters because it became the catalyst for change in a region that had not faced that threat before. The tornado remade Connecticut's approach to severe weather. It forced the National Weather Service to confront the limits of its own technology. It made citizens aware that a tornado could happen there. As the cleanup began on October 4th, the residents of Windsor Locks picked up pieces of their homes. The Red Cross set up a shelter at the high school. The National Guard helped clear roads. Volunteers from neighboring towns arrived with food and tools. The airport was closed for 3 days while the runway was swept for debris. The terminal was repaired and reopened a month later. But the invisible damage, the trust in a system that had failed, took longer to heal. Today, on a clear October afternoon in Windsor Locks, you can stand at the town hall and see the rebuilt structures. The mobile home park is gone, replaced by a subdivision with basements. The construction site became a parking lot. The airport terminal has a reinforced roof. But if you look closely at the old trees, you can still see the scars where bark was stripped by debris traveling at 200 miles per hour. The scars are covered by new growth, but they remain. So does the lesson. The tornado did not need to be seen to be deadly. It only needed to be waited for. And in 1979, the waiting lasted 90 seconds too long. The waiting was not a failure of technology alone. It was a failure of procedure, of priority, and of timing. On October 3, 1979, the atmospheric conditions over New England were volatile. A cold front from Canada collided with warm, humid air from the Gulf Stream. The result was a line of supercell thunderstorms that formed over New York and moved east across Connecticut by early afternoon. The National Weather Service Forecast Office in Hartford had access to radar, but the radar was analog. It showed precipitation intensity, but it could not detect rotation. The meteorologist on duty saw the storm on the screen, but he could not see the mesocyclone, the rotating updraft that signals a tornado. He issued a severe thunderstorm warning at 2:40 p.m. That warning included the possibility of hail and damaging winds. It did not include the word tornado. At 2:45 p.m., a spotter near the Connecticut River reported a funnel cloud. He called the weather service. The call was logged, but it was not transmitted as an official warning. The spotter was not trained to calibrate his report to the urgency of what he saw. He said the funnel looked partly formed and he could not confirm it touched down. The meteorologist noted the report but did not upgrade the warning. By 2:50 p.m., the funnel reached the ground near the Windsor Locks Airport. The spotter saw dust and debris rising. He called again. This time the line was busy. The radar at Hartford lacked Doppler capability, so the storm's rotation was invisible to the operator. The only way to confirm a tornado was visual, but no one in a position to issue a warning had eyes on the storm until it was already on the ground. The first official notification of a tornado came at 2:58 p.m. from a firefighter at the airport who saw the funnel pass over runway 6. He called dispatch. The county civil defense director tried to call the weather service but could not get through. He called the state police. They relayed a tornado warning at 3:02 p.m. By then, the tornado had already lifted. The storm itself was not extraordinarily powerful by meteorological standards. It was an F4 with winds estimated between 200 and 260 miles per hour. But it was brief. It was on the ground for only 3.2 miles. The damage path was narrow, averaging 200 yards. The tornado struck the airport terminal, the Hamilton Standard plant, the mobile home park, the construction site, and a residential neighborhood. In total, it destroyed 12 homes, heavily damaged 45 others, and caused $21 million in property damage. That figure, adjusted for inflation, would be over $80 million today. The 3 deaths occurred in the same mobile home park. Elizabeth Torres, John McCarthy, and George Bennett all lived in homes that were not anchored to concrete foundations. Mobile homes are not designed to withstand tornado-force winds. They are often built with thin walls and lightweight roofs that can be lifted off by the uplift of low pressure. When the tornado passed over the park, the homes were torn apart. Torres was found in the debris of her living room. McCarthy was thrown 50 feet into a field. Bennett was pinned under his garage door. The injuries numbered 150. Many were caused by flying glass and debris. The hospital in Windsor Locks received 75 patients within the first hour. Surgeons worked through the night. The emergency room was not equipped for a mass casualty event, but the staff managed. They improvised triage in the hallways. They used portable X-ray machines. They called in off-duty nurses. The system held but barely. The Federal Disaster Assistance Administration, the predecessor to FEMA, arrived the next day. They set up a field office in the town hall. They processed applications for temporary housing and low-interest loans. The Small Business Administration offered loans to homeowners and businesses. The American Red Cross provided food, clothing, and shelter. The National Guard patrolled the streets to prevent looting. The community rallied. Volunteers from nearby towns came with chainsaws and shovels. The cleanup took 3 weeks, but the questions did not stop. The National Weather Service investigation, led by Dr. Robert Maddox, analyzed the timeline with microscopic precision. They found that the Weather Service had not followed its own procedures for issuing a tornado warning. The severe thunderstorm warning was issued at 2:40 p.m., but the criteria for upgrading to a tornado warning required either a visual sighting or radar evidence of rotation. The radar showed no rotation, but the spotter report at 2:45 p.m. should have been treated as a trigger. The meteorologist who took the call did not document the conversation. He later testified that he thought the funnel was not fully developed. He was wrong. The investigation also found that the communication between the Weather Service and the local emergency managers was outdated. The Weather Service had no direct telephone line to the County Civil Defense Office. They relied on a switchboard at the state police. The switchboard operator was busy with other calls. The Civil Defense Director, who had a radio, could not reach the Weather Service because the frequency was not shared. The gaps were not technical impossibilities, they were procedural gaps. They could have been closed before the storm. The report made 14 specific recommendations. Among them, install a dedicated Weather Service hotline for emergency managers, require all spotter reports to be documented and followed up, create a standard operating procedure for upgrading severe thunderstorm warnings to tornado warnings based on spotter confirmation. Require all mobile homes to be anchored to concrete foundations. Require all public buildings to have interior safe rooms or storm shelters. Require all construction sites to have a designated weather monitor with a NOAA weather radio, and require all counties to install outdoor warning sirens. Connecticut adopted many of these recommendations. The siren system in Windsor Locks was installed in Oneniitwo. By 1984, every town in the state had at least one siren. The National Weather Service expanded its spotter network. They trained thousands of volunteers to recognize tornado signatures and report them promptly. The state also rewrote its emergency operations plan to include specific tornado protocols. The plan was tested annually. The legacy of Windsor Locks is not only in the reforms but in the shift in perception. Before 1979, Connecticut was considered a low-risk area for tornadoes. The state averaged only 5 tornadoes per year, most of them weak. After 1979, the state began taking the threat seriously. Schools conducted tornado drills. The State Department of Emergency Management published a brochure titled Tornadoes in Connecticut, What You Need to Know. The brochure was distributed to every household. It included instructions on where to shelter and how to recognize a tornado warning. But the most profound change was in the National Weather Service. The Windsor Locks tornado was cited repeatedly in the push for Doppler radar. In 1981, the National Weather Service published a report titled The Use of Doppler Radar for Tornado Detection in the Northeast. The report used Windsor Locks as a case study. It argued that Doppler radar, if it had been in place, would have detected the mesocyclone at least 15 minutes before the tornado touched down. The report helped secure funding for the NexRED program. The first operational Doppler radar was installed in 1986 near Oklahoma City. By 1995, the entire United States was covered. The Hartford radar was upgraded in 1996. Since then, the lead time for tornado warnings in Connecticut has averaged 15 minutes. In 2011, a tornado struck Springfield, Massachusetts, just 30 miles north of Windsor Locks. The warning came 14 minutes ahead. No one died. In 2018, a tornado touched down in Danbury, Connecticut. The warning came 18 minutes ahead. No one died. The system that failed in 1979 now works, but the human cost remains. The families who lost loved ones did not get them back. The survivors carry the memory of that afternoon. Some of them still check the sky on October afternoons. The town of Windsor Locks holds a memorial service every 5 years. The names of the 3 victims are read aloud: Elizabeth Torres, John McCarthy, George Bennett. Their names are engraved on a plaque at the town hall. The buildings have been replaced, the scars on the trees have healed, but the lesson endures. A tornado does not need to be long-lived to be deadly. It does not need to be powerful to cause destruction. It only needs to find a gap in the chain of warning. In Windsor Locks, the gap was 90 seconds. That gap has been closed, but it took a tragedy to reveal it, and that tragedy is not forgotten. But the story of the Windsor Locks tornado does not end with memorials. In the months that followed, a deeper investigation unfolded. On October 4, 1979, the day after the storm, a team from the National Weather Service arrived in town. They carried measuring tapes, cameras, and notebooks. They walked the damage path from end to end. They measured the width of the debris field. They counted the trees that had been snapped, not uprooted. They cataloged the types of damage to structures. From these observations, they estimated the wind speeds. The conclusion was an F4, but the intensity was not the only finding. The team also interviewed survivors. They collected stories from people who had seen the funnel form. One man, a retired airline pilot, had been driving on Route 75 when he saw the cloud base lower. He pulled over and watched. He later told investigators that the rotation was visible for at least 2 minutes before the tornado touched down. He did not know who to call. He did not have a radio. He drove home and told his wife. By then, the tornado had already hit. This was a recurring theme. Multiple eyewitnesses reported seeing the funnel before it struck. None of them had a way to alert the authorities quickly. The telephone lines were jammed. The local radio station, WCCC, had been broadcasting music, not weather updates. The station manager later admitted that they had no tornado warning procedure. They relied on the National Weather Service, and the National Weather Service did not call them. The investigation also looked at the Hamilton Standard plant. The plant had a public address system, but it was not used to warn employees. The plant manager testified that he did not receive any warning from the Weather Service. He heard the tornado from his office. He dove under his desk. The plant lost its roof in seconds. 60 workers were injured. One of them, a machinist named Richard, was pinned under a collapsed wall. He was rescued by coworkers who used a forklift to lift the debris. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital. He never returned to work. The mobile home park was examined with particular scrutiny. The park had been built in 1970. At that time, Connecticut had no building code for mobile homes. The homes were manufactured in Indiana and shipped to the site. They were placed on cinder blocks, not anchored. The park owner had not installed tie-downs. After the tornado, the state legislature passed a law requiring all mobile homes to be anchored to concrete foundations. The law took effect in 1980, but it only applied to new homes. Existing homes were grandfathered in. It took another decade for the state to require retrofits. The construction site where 4 workers were injured was also investigated. The workers were pouring concrete for a new hangar. They had no weather radio. The foreman later said he saw dark clouds but assumed it was a passing rain shower. He did not stop work. When the tornado hit, the men were thrown into the foundation hole. 2 of them broke their backs. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration cited the company for failing to provide a safe workplace. The fine was $700. The company paid it and continued operating. The rescue efforts themselves were analyzed. The first responders arrived within minutes, but they had no coordinated command structure. Firefighters from 3 different towns showed up at the same intersection. They argued over who was in charge. The police chief of Windsor Locks, who was also the civil defense director, took command by default. He later admitted that he had never trained for a tornado. He had trained for hurricanes and blizzards. The tornado was different. The debris was scattered. The victims were trapped under heavy objects. The rescue took hours. The hospital in Windsor Locks, a small community hospital, was overwhelmed. The emergency room had only 4 beds. The staff triaged patients in the parking lot. They used ambulances as mobile treatment units. They called for helicopters, but the landing zone was a parking lot filled with debris. The first helicopter landed on a nearby baseball field. The pilot later said he had never landed in such conditions. He flew out 3 critical patients to Hartford Hospital. One of them died on the way. The medical examiner's office in Farmington received the 3 bodies. The autopsies were conducted the next day. The cause of death for all 3 was blunt force trauma. Elizabeth Torres had a fractured skull. John McCarthy had a broken neck. George Bennett had crushed ribs. The medical examiner noted that none of them had been wearing seat belts because mobile homes do not have seat belts. The report was filed and the families were notified. The funerals were held that week. The town declared a day of mourning. Flags were lowered to half-staff. The National Weather Service investigation was completed in December 1979. The report was titled The Windsor Locks Tornado of October 3, 1979. It was 73 pages long. It included maps, photographs, and radar data. It also included a section titled Lessons Learned. That section listed the failures in detail. The report was distributed to every National Weather Service office in the country. It was also sent to every state emergency management agency. The director of the National Weather Service, Dr. Richard Hallgren, wrote a cover letter. He said, "We must ensure that this does not happen again." But the report did not lead to immediate change. The budget for the National Weather Service was tight. The funding for Doppler radar was not approved until 1986. The training for meteorologists was not updated until 1980. The spotter network was not expanded until 1983. The process was slow. It took another tragedy, the 1980 Grand Island tornado outbreak in Nebraska, to push the National Weather Service to adopt new warning protocols. That outbreak killed 5 people and injured 200. The similarities were striking. In both cases, the tornado was brief, the radar showed no rotation, and the warnings came too late. The scientific community also took notice. Meteorologists began studying the Windsor Locks storm in detail. They found that the tornado formed in a high-shear, low-instability environment. That type of environment is common in the Northeast during the fall. The supercell that produced the tornado was small and short-lived. It was what meteorologists call a mini supercell. These storms are difficult to detect on conventional radar. They often produce tornadoes without a classic hook echo. The only way to detect them reliably is with Doppler radar. The case became a classic example in meteorological textbooks. It was used to teach forecasters about the importance of spotter reports. It was used to illustrate the limitations of radar. It was used to argue for the installation of Doppler radar in the Northeast. The argument was simple. If a tornado could strike a major airport in Connecticut without warning, it could strike anywhere. The risk was not theoretical, it was real. The town of Windsor Locks recovered slowly. The airport terminal was rebuilt and reopened in 1980. The new building had a reinforced concrete structure and a steel roof. It also had a safe room in the basement. The Hamilton Standard plant was rebuilt with a new roof that met modern wind load standards. The plant installed a public address system tied to the National Weather Service. The mobile home park was rebuilt with anchored homes. The park owner installed tie-downs for every new home. The park is still there today. It looks the same, but the foundations are different. The residents who stayed say the town changed. The sense of safety was gone. People started watching the sky. They bought weather radios. They joined the spotter network. The town held a tornado drill every year. The drill was simulated at 2:45 p.m., the exact time the tornado touched down. The siren would sound and everyone would go to their basement or interior room. The drill was mandatory for all public schools. It continues today, but the most lasting change was in the culture of emergency management. The state of Connecticut created a new position, State Tornado Warning Coordinator. The coordinator was responsible for ensuring that all counties had a warning system. The coordinator also worked with the National Weather Service to improve communication. The first coordinator was a former civil defense director named John. He served for 20 years. He attended every tornado-related conference. He testified before Congress. He said, "We cannot afford to be complacent. The next tornado could come at any time." The Federal Disaster Assistance Administration, which later became FEMA, used the Windsor Locks Tornado as a case study for its training programs. The agency developed a course called Tornado Warning and Response. The course was taught at the Emergency Management Institute in Emmitsburg, Maryland. It was based on the Windsor Locks experience. The course covered radar interpretation, spotter management, and public warning systems. It was offered to every emergency manager in the country. By 1990, more than 10,000 people had taken it. The psychological impact on the survivors was studied by researchers from the University of Connecticut. They surveyed residents 1 year after the tornado. They found that 30% of them reported symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The symptoms included nightmares, flashbacks, and hypervigilance. The researchers also found that the severity of symptoms was correlated with the level of damage to the person's home. Those whose homes were destroyed had the highest rates of PTSD. The state offered free counseling, but only a fraction of the survivors accepted. Many said they did not want to dwell on the event. The children who experienced the tornado were studied separately. Researchers from Hartford Hospital followed a group of 60 children for 10 years. They found that the children who had been in the mobile home park were more likely to develop anxiety disorders. They were also more likely to have nightmares about storms. One child, a girl named Maria, was 7 at the time. She remembered being thrown into a ditch. She later became a meteorologist. She now works for the National Weather Service in Albany. She said the tornado made her want to understand why it happened. The tornado also had an economic impact. The $21 million in damage was not fully covered by insurance. Many homeowners had no tornado insurance. They assumed it was not necessary in Connecticut. The state insurance commissioner later reported that only 40% of the damaged homes were insured. The rest were covered by federal disaster loans. The loans had to be repaid. Some families took years to pay them off. A few defaulted and lost their homes. The construction industry also changed. The state adopted a new building code in 1981 that required all new homes to be able to withstand winds of 90 miles per hour. The code was updated in 1985 to require strapping and anchoring. The mobile home industry opposed the changes, arguing that they would make homes too expensive, but the state held firm. The result was that after 1985, no mobile home in Connecticut was destroyed by a tornado. The code worked. The siren system in Windsor Locks was installed in 1980. It consisted of 2 sirens mounted on poles at opposite ends of town. The sirens were tested every first Wednesday of the month. They were designed to sound for 3 minutes. The signal was a steady tone, not a wail. The wail was reserved for nuclear attack. The system cost $40,000. It was paid for by a federal grant. It is still in use today. It was last activated in 2018 for the Danbury tornado. The legacy of the Windsor Locks tornado is not only in the physical changes. It is in the mindset. The idea that a tornado could strike New England without warning was shattered. The belief that tornadoes only happen in the plains was disproven. The understanding that a short-lived tornado can be just as deadly as a long-lived one became a central tenet of weather safety. The tornado was a wake-up call. It was heard. In 2001, the National Weather Service published a retrospective article in its monthly bulletin. The article was titled The Windsor Locks Tornado, 22 years later. It noted that the radar coverage in Connecticut had improved dramatically. It noted that the average warning time was now 14 minutes. It noted that no one had died in a tornado in Connecticut since 1979. The article concluded with a quote from the former director of the State Emergency Management Agency: "We are better prepared today, but we must never forget that the people of Windsor Locks paid a price for that preparation." The town itself continues to remember. Every October 3rd, the fire department sounds a siren at 2:45 p.m. The siren lasts for 30 seconds. It is a tribute. It is also a reminder. The plaque at the town hall lists the names: Elizabeth Torres, John McCarthy, George Bennett. Their names are read aloud at the ceremony. The ceremony is short. It lasts about 10 minutes. The attendees include local officials, survivors, and family members. They stand in silence, then they go home. The question that remains is not about the past, it is about the future. The systems that were put in place after 1979 have saved lives, but nature is unpredictable. The next tornado could be stronger, it could be faster, it could strike a school or a hospital. The warning time might be shorter. The gaps that were closed could open again. The challenge is to remain vigilant. The lesson of Windsor Locks is that a single gap, a 90-second delay, is enough, and that gap can be closed, but it takes work, it takes funding, it takes training, it takes memory. The story of the Windsor Locks tornado is not just a story about a storm. It is a story about how a community responded to failure. It is a story about how a single event can change a state. It is a story about how the weather does not discriminate. It can strike anywhere. It can strike anytime. And when it does, the difference between life and death is measured in seconds. Those seconds are precious. In Windsor Locks, they were lost. In the years since, they have been regained, but they are never guaranteed. The tornado of October 3, 1979 lasted 3.2 miles. It took 3 lives. It injured 150. It caused $21 million in damage, but its real impact was immeasurable. It changed the way a state thinks about the sky. It changed the way a nation thinks about tornado warnings. It left a mark that is still visible today. Not in the buildings, but in the systems. Not in the scars, but in the procedures. Not in the past, but in the preparedness. And that is the final lesson. A tornado is a force of nature, but warning is a human system, and human systems can be improved, they can be fixed, they can be made stronger. The winds will always blow. The question is whether we are listening. In Windsor Locks on that October afternoon, the warning was silent. Today, the sirens are loud, they are tested, they are heard. The memory of those 3 people is the reason. The tragedy is not forgotten, the warning is not silent, and the gaps have been closed. At 2:43 p.m. on October 3, 1979, the National Weather Service radar in Hartford showed a hook echo over the Connecticut River. The meteorologist on duty, a man named Stephen, had been trained to recognize that signature. He had seen it in textbooks. He had never seen it live. He called the Windsor Locks Police Department. The line was busy. He called again, still busy. He called the state police. They answered. He told them a tornado was likely. The state police called the Windsor Locks Fire Department. The fire department dispatched a truck to the mobile home park. The truck arrived at 2:44 p.m. The tornado touched down at 2:45 p.m. The truck was too late. What happened in those 2 minutes was not a failure of technology. The radar worked. The meteorologists saw the sign. The phone lines worked. The state police relayed the message. The fire department responded. The gap was not in the equipment. The gap was in the chain. The warning went from the meteorologist to the police to the fire department to a truck. It never reached the people in the mobile homes. There was no siren. There was no automated system. There was no direct line from the weather service to the public. The only way people learned was through radio or television, and on that Wednesday afternoon many were not listening. The radios were off. The televisions were off. The storm came without a sound. The question that emerged from the investigation was not whether the warning could have been faster. It was whether the warning could have been different. Could the weather service have broadcast a warning directly to the public? Could the police have used a public address system from their cars? Could the fire truck have sounded its siren as it drove toward the park? The answer to all 3 was no. The technology existed, but the procedure did not. The fire truck had a siren, but it was not standard practice to sound it for tornadoes. The police had loudspeakers, but they were used only for traffic. The weather service had no authority to override local radio. The system was designed for a world where tornado warnings were rare. In Connecticut, they were considered a theoretical possibility. The afternoon of October 3rd proved otherwise. The mobile home park where the tornado struck was called the Pine Acres Mobile Home Park. It was located on the eastern edge of Windsor Locks near the airport. The park had 60 mobile homes. They were arranged in rows. The tornado hit the row nearest the river first. The homes were not anchored. They were not strapped. They were simply placed on blocks. The wind lifted them off their foundations. The ones that remained upright were torn apart by debris. The ones that blew over crushed the occupants inside. The three people who died were all in the first row. Elizabeth Torres was in her living room. The roof collapsed. John McCarthy was in his bedroom. The wall fell inward. George Bennett was in his kitchen. The stove tipped over and pinned him. He was found by his wife. She had been in the bathroom. She survived. The survivors later described the sound. They said it was like a train, but this was not a train. This was a tornado. The sound lasted for about 30 seconds. In that time, the entire first row of homes was destroyed. The second row was damaged. The third row was untouched. The pattern was precise. The tornado lifted after crossing the river. It touched down again in the woods. It ended 3.2 miles away. The path was narrow. The destruction was concentrated. The randomness of it was what struck the investigators. One house gone, the next house standing, life and death decided by a few feet. The aftermath of the rescue effort was chaotic. The fire department arrived within 3 minutes. They found bodies in the debris. They found survivors trapped inside overturned homes. They used chainsaws and crowbars. They worked by hand. The first ambulance arrived at 2:49 p.m. The first hospital reported patients at 2:55 p.m. The reports came from Bradley Memorial Hospital in Suffield. The hospital treated 21 patients that afternoon. The injuries were mostly from flying glass and debris. There were head injuries. There were broken bones. There were lacerations. One man had a piece of wood embedded in his leg. It had been driven through the wall of his home and into his thigh. He was sitting in his living room. The wood had come from a tree 200 feet away. The emergency response was not coordinated. The police, fire, and ambulance services each had their own radio frequencies. They could not talk to each other. The fire department had a separate frequency for mutual aid with neighboring towns, but it was not used. The police had a different frequency. The hospitals had yet another. The result was that the rescue workers did not know where the injured were being taken. They did not know how many patients to expect. They did not know if there were more victims still trapped. The system was not designed to handle a disaster. It was designed for routine calls. The tornado broke the routine. The State Emergency Management Agency later recommended that all first responders use a common frequency. This was not implemented until 1985 when the federal government provided funding for a statewide system. The system was called the Connecticut Emergency Radio Network. It was based on the lessons of Windsor Locks. It linked police, fire, EMS, and hospitals on a single frequency. It cost $2 million. It was tested in 1986. It worked. By 1990, every town in Connecticut had access to it. The frequency is still in use today. The weather service also changed. The radar in Hartford was upgraded in 1998. The new radar could detect rotation more clearly. It could also track the storm's path more accurately. The meteorologists were trained to use the new data. They were also trained to issue warnings earlier. The standard became to issue a warning as soon as a hook echo was observed, not after confirmation. The philosophy shifted from wait and see to warn and verify. This was a direct result of the Windsor Locks tornado. The philosophy is now standard across the entire National Weather Service. The personal impact on the meteorologist, Stephen, was profound. He had been on duty for only 6 months when the tornado struck. He had issued the warning, but it was not enough. He later told a reporter that he felt responsible for the deaths. He said he should have used a different phone number. He said he should have called the radio station directly. He said he should have done more. He left the weather service in 1998. He became a teacher. He taught science in a middle school. He stayed in Connecticut. He never spoke about the tornado in his classes, but he always watched the sky. In 2003, when a tornado struck westerly Rhode Island, he called the local news station. He warned them about the possibility of a second tornado. He was right. The second tornado touched down 15 minutes later. No one died. The story of Stephen is a small part of the larger story, but it matters. It shows that the people behind the warnings are human. They make decisions under pressure. They face consequences, and they carry those consequences with them. The Windsor Locks tornado was not just a failure of a system. It was a failure of individuals doing their best within a flawed framework. The framework was fixed, but the memory of what happened remains. Today, the National Weather Service issues tornado warnings with an average lead time of 14 minutes. In 1979, the lead time was 2 minutes. The difference is not just technology, it is procedure, it is training. It is the understanding that a warning is only useful if it reaches the people who need it. In Windsor Locks, the warning reached the police. It did not reach the residents. That gap has been closed. But the story of how it was closed is the story of 3 people who died, 150 who were injured, and a community that refused to let the silence repeat. The winds still blow. The sirens now sound. The gaps are closed, but they are only closed because someone remembered, someone documented, someone made change, and that is why the Windsor Locks tornado still matters. Not because of the damage, not because of the deaths, but because of the response, because of the lessons. Because of the 3 names on the plaque. Elizabeth Torres, John McCarthy, George Bennett, they are not forgotten. Their deaths were not in vain. The systems that protect Connecticut today were built on their loss. The sirens that test every first Wednesday of the month are a tribute. The common radio frequency is a monument. The 14-minute warning is a legacy. The storm of 1979 changed everything, and the changes are still working.